Good evening. Welcome to the Autism Blogcast. I'm Jim Mancini.
And I'm Rafe Bernier.
It's time for our top 10 countdown of 2017. And there were so many things that we could have mentioned that we wanted to start with some honorable mentions. The honorable mentions are the words diversity, fetus, transgender, vulnerable, entitlement, science-based, and evidence-based. Over to you, Rafe.
Great. Well, with that honorable mention under our belts, let's jump into the number 10 spot. And this year, coming in at number 10, are two epidemiological studies focusing on folic acid. What these findings suggested were that prenatal usage of folic acid can really reduce the risk of autism, and specifically the risk of autism with comorbid intellectual disability. What was exciting about these two studies, which were evidence-based, which was the focus on what we can actually do to potentially mitigate the risk for developing autism. That's number 10.
Number 9, BCBA licensure in Washington State. This year, the Washington State Department of Health finalized rules that regulated licensure for BCBAs in the state. Up to this point, there really hadn't been any rules around who could be a BCBA in Washington. What hopefully will happen is that this is going to invite more BCBAs and it's going to increase the capacity to access these services for this really important evidence-based practice. We still have a huge wait list in Washington State. So if you are an ABA therapist out there, think about moving to the Northwest.
Great. Coming in at number 8 is the updated strategic plan issued by the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, or IACC. What the IACC is a public-private partnership group of stakeholders in the autism community. These would be parents, self-advocates, clinicians, scientists, members from state and federal governments who come together to identify what the priorities are for moving autism research forward. In this past year, the IACC Strategic Report really dedicated a whole chapter to providing support for the currently underserved population of adults with autism.
Okay, well, speaking of adults with autism, our number 7 this year is the rising voice of the autistic self-advocate community. And they've joined with the disability rights community to advocate for issues related to adults with autism. Some of these issues include issues such as unemployment, housing issues, transgender issues, and accessing appropriate mental health supports. So, as we've also reported, there is a divide between parent advocates and autistic advocates. So watch for 2018 for more information about this breaking issue.
Great. Coming in at number 6 from 2017 were new findings in the realm of genetics research. Specifically in 2017, we really started to see the rise of the importance of what's called somatic mosaicism in autism. Now, what researchers did this past year was focused on post-zygotic mutations. So what these types of mutations are, these are changes in our DNA that occur after fertilization of an embryo. Notice I didn't say the word fetus, but I could have said the word fetus, but I said embryo in this case. So the mutations occur after fertilization of the embryo. What that means is, what that results in is that not all cells in the body have the same DNA. So that some cells in the body might have one sort of arrangement of DNA, another might have a different arrangement of DNA. What the studies found this year was that these post-zygotic mutations can account for up to 3 to 4% of all individuals with autism, suggesting that that's kind of what might be happening at the genetic level for a small portion of individuals with autism.
Okay. All right. Coming in at number 5, inclusion. There's been a lot of discussion about inclusion in our community, especially in Washington State, and coming from different directions. There's been more inclusive hiring practices, and certainly plenty of organizations that have stepped forward and really promoted inclusion in our community. We reported on the Welcome Inclusion initiative this summer when there was a big symposium hosted at Microsoft campus. And what we really want to focus on here is what are our next steps in regards to inclusion in our community.
Great. Coming in at number 4. were studies published by the Infant Brain Imaging Study. Now, this is a network of scientists that really focused on utilizing imaging tools in very early development for younger siblings of children with autism. And what they found this year and reported this year was that by tracking growth development, brain growth development very early on, the first 6 to 12 months of life, that can predict brain overgrowth in 12 to 18 months of life. And then that can also be used to predict autism symptomatology, specifically social deficits we see in autism. What they then did was they utilized pretty complicated machine learning algorithms to determine, based on these early markers of imaging findings of the brain, again, 6 to 12 months of age, that could predict which children would go on to develop autism. So pretty exciting in terms of informing the pathophysiology of what's happening in the brain in autism. Does it mean that every 6-month-old child is going to get a brain scan walking through at the 6-month pediatric checkup? Unlikely. But it does, again, as I mentioned, inform that pathophysiology. So really exciting findings in thinking about what's going on in the brain for autism.
Okay, great. Coming in at number 3, some progress made towards the McCleary decision in Washington State. This year, the legislature approved and Governor Inslee signed a proposal of a budget of $7.3 million over the next 4 years that aims to satisfy the court orders to adequately fund public education. Now, there's still some issues that remain, including the arbitrary and somewhat bizarre funding cap on special education within specific districts, but it's an important step forward to better supporting this vulnerable population.
Great. And number 2 from 2017 is the focus on females. Specifically, there have been a couple of studies that came out this year that helped explore the idea of the female protective effect. Now, we've long known there's been a disparity in the diagnostic rate for girls relative to boys. That is, boys are diagnosed about 3 to 4 times more often than boys. 3 to 4 times more often autism diagnosed in boys relative to girls. And there's been a lot of questions about why that is. So some work is focused on what's called the female protective effect, which suggests that girls need kind of a little extra oomph to actually develop autism. That might mean that there are multiple genetic events or a combination of genetics and other events that kind of provide the perfect maelstrom of challenges. And that needs to be more for girls than for boys. The other work that happened this year was exploring this notion of what's called the camouflage effect, that girls with autism tend to camouflage some of the challenges that we see associated with autism relative to boys. So I just want to highlight that focus on understanding that gender disparity in autism was a real focus of 2017. Look forward to seeing what happens in the coming years.
Okay, and finally, coming in at number 1 this year was something that actually didn't happen. And what didn't happen, there was no repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And as we know, the Affordable Care Act has increased the ability for people to take advantage of Medicaid services. And in Washington State specifically, that has led to increased availability to important evidence-based treatments such as ABA. So, it's still to be seen what happens next year. One thing to note is the new tax cuts that were just passed the next steps will likely be thinking about some spending cuts and entitlement programs, including Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, DDA. Those are all up in the air in regards to how those are going to be funded, and if there are spending cuts, those might be places that would be cut right away. So, important to pay attention to, and we'll be reporting on this developing story in 2018.
Well, that's it for our top 10 of 2017. Make sure to tune in on January 19th of 2018 for the Jim and Rafe State of Autism Address. We'll be holding that as part of our Autism 200 series.
Don't miss your chance to see Jim and Rafe live, and if you don't live nearby here in Seattle, you can always stream all of our Autism 200 lectures from home. Thanks for watching, and Happy New Year 2018.
Perfect.